Hello, this is the interpreter doing a sound check on the English channel. Could I have some incoming sound from your end, please?
Hier im Saal. So, jetzt wird
Yeah, you should be able to hear me now online as well. I would like to bid you welcome to this crisis talk in the Hessian representation in Brussels. My name is Stefanie Loeb. I am correspondent for Agence France-Presse in Brussels. The organization of the crisis talk is done with the Leibniz community and with the Goethe University of Frankfurt. We're talking about how successful the European sanctions against such Russia in the context of the Ukrainian war are. We also want to talk about the risks and side effects. First, I would like to invite you to listen to a welcome word by Lucia Puttrich. Mr. Gahler, dear Dr. Deitelhoff, dear Dr. Schwarz, dear Miss Loeb, and ladies and gentlemen. Dear
Unsere hessischen Landesvertretung in Brüssel begrüßen.
I would like to start by thanking our partners with the Leibniz Association and the Goethe University, Frankfurt, that were able to present something amazing for you today. It's about a very interesting subject. Can be evaded. Well, to some extent it is possible to avoid some of the effects through the Emirates, China and Turkey, among others. So the first question is, do the sanctions have any effect, and who does it have an effect on? Only for the ones that should be impacted by it, or also on others? We can see that these sanctions also have an impact on the global economy. It has huge ramifications on the supply on the global food market. And this is something that's being used as a strategic pressure means. So we have arguments in front and against after sanctions. That is what we'll be discussing today. What use are sanctions? Which lines are we not to cross, and what do we have to change or do on top of what it is we're doing today? I hope you have a very interesting discussion, and I would like to bid you welcome. Yes, thank you very much for bidding us welcome, Ms. Puttrich. I would very much like to ask Ms. Deitelhoff to come to the stage, who is responsible for conflict studies in Frankfurt am Main University, and she's going to give us an introduction in the subject. You have the floor, Ms. Deitelhoff. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank myself with the thank the Hessian representation for the great cooperation for these crisis talks. And of course, I am not the only one who is responsible for the quality of the content of these crisis talks. The Hessian representation is responsible for this. The team behind us is responsible for this. And I'm just in a position to take advantage of this great cooperation. So how effective are these sanctions against Russia exactly? Well, the sanctions against Russia that have started early 2022, and we've just had the 13th package, are effective. And that is actually the main goal. We have to make sure that Russia is deterred from continuing the war in Ukraine and to limit their power as a nation state. So how can I make sure that these sanctions work? Well, it's not like other people think. She is not able, Russia is not able, Russia does not want to run away from this war immediately yet, but the sanctions do work because it's much more difficult for them to finance the sanctions, and it's much more difficult to keep the Russian economy afloat. And that is just as important. It sets a very clear signal to the international community that attacking another country will have terrible consequences for the aggressor. So on the subject, do sanctions work? We have to talk about the fact that sanctions don't just follow this one major goal. They have several goals. We should distinguish three separate goals. First, we want to elicit a change in behavior. Secondly, we want to constrict or constrain the possibilities of the aggressor. And thirdly, we want to make clear to everyone that being an aggressor in the war will not be accepted. This is called signaling. And in the context of these three goals that sanctions can have, we can say that these sanctions in the regard of coercion are not as strong, and that's going to stay the same way, but it's much more efficient when it comes to constraining and signaling. Let us discuss these points separately. Why don't we have successful coercion strategy? At the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many associated the imposition of the surprisingly tough sanction packages, including the disconnection of Russian banks from international payments, with destabilizing Russia and getting Putin to relent. So far, this goal has not been achieved, nor is it likely to be achieved by the sanctions. The reasons are that sanctions against Russia cannot cut it off from the main source of income, which are energy exports. This is because of the development of the sanction packages, we were not able to develop a complete alternative. The European states needed time to develop their own strategy, which also gave Russia time to change his strategy. With some discounts, they're now selling to China and India. This is not a full compensation for the sanction, but it does mean that they do not lose this source of income. Something else that is rarely said is that Russia is a huge economy that is stronger and more resilient than the typical economies that get sanctions imposed upon them. Means that if you sanction a very big and strong economy, and people like to say that they're not really big and strong anymore, and maybe it's not a terribly effective economy, but it's still a very big one. It's very difficult to do coercion on very big economies like that. It's mostly about signaling and restriction. And Russia is very experienced in sanctions as well. They have prepared by taking several steps and making sure that they were able to dance around the sanctions more efficiently. Constraining, however, works. The sanction strategy imposed by the European Union and its partners is only one part of the strategy in dealing with Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, the other being military support to Ukraine through arms deliveries and training assistance. Given the course of the war so far, we can assume that this military component remains central to stopping Russia. This is where the second function of sanctions plays in, limiting the sanctioned party's ability to act. In this case, there are still many resources that Russia can use to put into the war, but we can limit them by preventing that they're not able to resupply any chip-controlled equipment into the war. If you look at the developments in the West, you can see that the things that are being provided are much more heterogeneous. They have to use other products to make sure that they can still use the chips for war. Overall, Russia's economy is taking enormous damage because it lacks electronic components, such as these semiconductors, and they rely on the support of China. Thirdly, the signaling also works. The function that the Russia sanctions also perform well is a communicative function. The signaling to all other states that blatant breaches of the rules, such as Russia's war of aggression, will not be tolerated but will be accompanied by negative consequences. While it's true that condemnation of Russia's war of aggression in the UN is not universal, and that those states that abstained or rejected relevant UN condemnations comprise more than half of the world's population, and it's always good to remind you of this, the signaling effect is nevertheless evident. there's still a large amount of countries that condemn what it is Russia is doing. Initial surveys and survey data show that the norm of territorial integrity has grown in acceptance over time, and more respondents favor sanctions to enforce it. This is an indicator that signaling does have an impact. Maybe also important as well is that China, in the late weeks, is becoming more interested in talks with the European Union and the United States. So this could also be a way to not increase the tension. This is a minor positive signal. With a view to the three functions of sanctions, it becomes clear once again that sanctions are a long-term instrument and not suitable for sprinting, if you will. They are particularly effective in combination with other means, particularly with dealing with large and resource-rich economies. It's the restrictions and signaling that are most effective. Accordingly, it makes sense to continue leveraging here. So what do we have to do to achieve this? Well, firstly, we need to prevent sanction evasions as much as possible. In the 11th sanctions package, the European Union does just this. The export control for companies has been limited. We have put a ban on advanced tech goods, and there has been a ban on ship-to-ship transport. If within 1 year EU and US imports to countries like Armenia and Kazakhstan multiply, and at the same time exports to these countries to Russia also multiply, it's a clear sign of sanctions evasion, the parallel imports. And this needs to be limited somehow. Otherwise, we lose the constraining effect of these sanctions. At the same time, the 11th sanction package sets higher hurdles for the use of the new enforcement tools, such as exhaustion of cooperation. And this makes things more difficult, of course. Something else we've seen and heard is that there's a circumvention through Turkey and China, particularly for chip exports. Chinese companies are taken off the export control and sanctions list after Beijing demarches, for example. I'll get back to that in a bit. All in all, we have a pretty mixed result, with more sanction extensions than effective implementation mechanisms. This is not least due to the fact that there are two opposing camps within the EU. Those who want a comprehensive sanctions regime despite all associated costs, such as the Baltic states and Poland, and those who want a sanctions regime that is easy on their own economies as possible, such as Germany or France. In addition, there are countries such as Hungary that form a third group that question the actual existence of these sanctions. Measures that increase the cost of the sanctions for the sanctioners are hardly enforceable at present. At the same time, however, and this is very important for me to stress, there are also concerns about not alienating third countries. We can't lose Armenia or Kyrgyzstan. Do we want them to be EU-oriented, or do we want them to be Russia or China-oriented? Of course, we want them to be oriented towards us. In a situation where we have many countries still sitting on the fence, it is very important that we keep an open attitude. If we shut them down, it's not going to be productive for us. We have to set a clear course for the sanctions, which is why this has been discussed very intensively, and new, more severe sanctions are very unlikely and counterproductive. We need to make sure that we can offer something enticing to these countries so they want to follow the sanctions. They could get some rebates, for example. We need to have more creativity on this. At the same time, China is a completely different case. With China, it's all about signaling. And we have to make sure that the Chinese companies stay on the list of sanctions companies, with the purpose of ending the war in Russia and protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. The sanctions work best when we limit Russia as much as possible while supporting Ukraine with high-grade weapon systems as much as possible. That's how we can force Russia to negotiate. The more coordinated the sanctions and countermeasures are, the more quickly they happen, the better and more efficient these measures will be. This is a matter of pressure and counter-pressure, but it is something we have to follow through on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Deitelhoff, for this very interesting presentation. Before asking other panel participants to join us on the panel, I would also like to remind you that all viewers can send in questions, and I think we should be able to see the contact details. Email streamline at lv-brüssel.hessen.de or by telephone. You can see the telephone number as well. And now, Mr. Schwarz and Mr. Gahler, please join us on stage, please.
Schwarz.
Mr. Schwarz, please sit here, and Mr. Gahler, you would sit on my left-hand side. I'm going to present you very briefly Dr. Andreas Schwarz, the General Director of OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Office, and Mr. Gahler, MEP, Permanent Rapporteur of the European Parliament for Ukraine. Ms. Deitelhoff, I would like to start with you. You said that we need a lot of patience with regards to sanctions policy. The sanctions are effective, but they also have limitations. Now it is the case that Ukraine and also EU states, EU member states that support them, such as Poland, they actually ask for sanctions to be enforced and for sanctions to be more severe in order to achieve the targets, to get Putin to the negotiating table from Western states. If you talk to representatives here in Brussels, they are rather careful. They say that a lot of means have already been used with regards to sanctions. It is very difficult to find other areas where sanctions can be imposed. If we have a 12th, 13th or 14th sanction package, would that only be a symbolic measure? No, not at all. I think we can, in almost all areas, we can have higher sanctions. I don't think this is the issue. The question is, are we going to have agreement from everyone for these sanction packages? We already saw that acceptance has reduced, and we have this fundamental question: is it worth it to impose higher sanctions, or should we rather see how we can use the existing sanctions to the best extent? At the one hand, we have the difficulty to have a consensus for higher sanctions. And that obviously always means also certain consequences for our economies. And then we also have the other question with regards to third countries. But that means that we are going to have more sanction packages? Yes, I assume so. Mr. Schwarz, let's move to you. Perhaps we should explain why someone from OLAF is actually has actually joined our panel discussion today. You don't only fight against fraud with regards to tax payments or corruption, but you also work in the area of sanctions. You are some type of a sanction detective, perhaps we can call it that. And perhaps you can just explain from practice what exactly you are doing. Yes. OLAF is mainly responsible for the protection of financial interests, but we are also active with regards to legal aid between certain authorities. We've been doing that since the year of 1979, and I can also say that OLAF is not the only authority within the Commission. GD FISMA and other units are also responsible for this type of work, but we are not the only ones who work in the area of sanction evasion and topics such as that. But what makes OLAF rather special is the following. We are the only service within the Commission that can actually investigate, due to the fact that for the normal EU budget, we can actually investigate companies. We can carry out so-called on-the-spot checks. We have a lot of competences within that area. And the Commission, I think, also is in the process of discovering that this can be rather effective also with regards to sanctions. Perhaps two examples. First of all, it is about illegal imports from Russia into the EU. Obviously, a lot of goods have been put on the sanctions lists. This is where we have had actual cases, successful cases, and they can also be found in our annual report of this year, how we managed to avoid illegal imports. And what kind of goods does that affect? For example, wood, timber, but also other products that Russia exports into the EU. But what is rather new, and this is rather unusual, is the fact that we also work on the topic of avoiding exports towards Russia, and that affects products such as microchips, any material that can be used for the production of arms. And this is all the more important, and this is why the Americans have also discovered OLAF as a cooperation partner, since they obviously have a huge interest in these things, in the fact that these things don't happen. And we now have a so-called joint enforcement operation. All member states are participating, also the US, the UK, Canada. And these also companies from these sectors have joined in. Obviously, they also don't want for their goods to be exported to Russia. This can have a damaging effect to their reputation. And this is also about exchanging information about individual companies. You mentioned it earlier. Obviously, we can observe the flow of goods, and we can actually find things that are perhaps irregular. But this does not mean that we have the capacity to act. We actually have to prove that a company that perhaps used to export goods, perhaps drones, to Russia, that they now go via Kazakhstan. We actually have to provide proof. We have to provide evidence that this is happening. And this obviously also has to do a lot with intelligence gathering, with analyzing data. We have to communicate. And obviously, OLAF is a European authority, and therefore we have a good network with other member states. And this is what we do in this area. So we are very much on the enforcement side. You just mentioned drones and classical military technology, but there are also those cases where fridges, washing machines, calculators have been exported into the EU or to Russia. Yes, obviously. we have to be careful. Not every product that is on the sanctions list, we don't look after every one of these products. We look after those that are very relevant for the arms production. You can imagine there are a lot of different trade routes that we have to analyze, and this is rather complex. But we do actually look at a lot of those elements, and we are actually in agreement with the US with regards to these lists. They know what kind of material Russia needs in order to produce arms. Therefore, obviously, electronics are rather interesting, electronics that are being used for arms production. Yes. Obviously, we shouldn't think that the Russian military is using washing machines or washing machine products, components in order to produce arms. I think Russia still has quite a number of chips that they have also received from China, and they use that for arms production. Well, let's move to Mr. Gahler. We just talked about loopholes with regards to sanctions, but we have certain areas where there are no sanctions. For example, there is no gas embargo with regards to Russia, and we don't have any stop with regards to the nuclear cooperation between Russia and countries such as France and Hungary. These are not only just loopholes, but these are actually areas that haven't been touched by the sanctions at all. Yes, that is true. We haven't, in certain cases, we don't have any sanctions. And if there are no sanctions, these exports or imports are not illegal. Austria, for example, they came to an agreement with Croatia with regards to LNG terminals. This could be an alternative, but I think Austria is also still receiving gas deliveries from Russia. And I think this is something that we have to work on. I think continuing to trade with this aggressor, I think this should be a political scandal and should be put on the agenda, and we should find solutions. Indeed. We in the Parliament, we have always advocated for the fact to actually move into these areas where we haven't introduced sanctions yet. For example, also personal sanctions. We have lists of more than 6,000 people, lists that were created by Mr. Navalny. Some of them have already been sanctioned, but some, quite a large number of these individuals that have benefited a lot from the Russian system, they haven't been sanctioned yet. But obviously, another question is how can we access accounts? And I think this is an area that would actually hurt Russia a lot. And this is something that member states could also do. We could actually cancel their long-term visa. They don't actually have any legal claim to be entitled to a visa. So this is something that member states could rather easily do. I think this is something that we should do, and this is something that we should do across the EU, since there would be no possibility for those individuals to any legal recourse once their visa is cancelled. I don't think it is. I don't think it is still necessary for Russian individuals to be able to go to Baden-Baden to play in the casino. What has also been mentioned is the following. We have the rule that oil that has been exported from Russia into other countries is still being transported by our ships. With all of the money that we have been spending with regards to Ukraine, I think we should reimburse those companies to the extent we should reimburse them, and we should tell them to leave those ships within the port. if those ships would disappear from our world seas, they wouldn't be able to be replaced in other countries. And I think it would be rather easy to determine the loss of income for those companies, but I would advocate for the fact that we use money in order to reimburse the companies for their loss of income when those ships are no longer being used. But this would also have an effect in the sense that Russia would no longer be able to transport oil to other countries.
I would like to remind you all that you are able to send us questions. The email address is streamline -lv at... I'll get back to that. The phone number is 0032. As I said in the beginning, we would like to talk about the risks and side effects as well. So to just get a general overview of things. So, Ms. Deitelhoff, we've had smart sanctions as a subject for a while. We have a negative example, bad example being Iran, where we've had economic sanctions that have had a strong impact on the civilians as well. Since 2018, under the Trump administration, even the national health became impacted, particularly during the pandemic. To which extent has the European Union learned from this? How smart are the sanctions in Russia? Or is it even wanted that the Russian people suffer? If you have any questions, go to streamline at lv.hessen.de. If I look at the development and how the European Union does sanctions, then they've definitely learned how to do smart sanctions. They want to limit the side effects. Of course, this doesn't work with all sanctions quite as well, and it doesn't quite work for the Russia sanctions. We have a very comprising group of sanctions, and we want to impact as many parts of Russian economy as possible. If we would go for very specific sanctions, we would hit only the people who have asked for this war, who wanted this war, and who commanded this war. But this is virtually impossible. You always have side effects. With any sanctions, you have to analyze what's good and what's bad about the sanctions, and to which effect the side effects, the negative side effects, are stronger than the means you want to use. This can change over time as well. The longer sanctions are in effect, the more the unwanted effects take priority. Another point that I'm coming to as well is that sanctions are particularly effective if I can turn them back down again. If I can do something that will lead me to relieving sanctions to a certain extent. And this is something that we need to work on more for the Russian sanctions. When do we start lifting these sanctions, if even partially? So that means politics need to talk about this more clearly, what Putin needs to do to end the sanctions, partially or fully. And let's talk about the civilians as well. Initially, politicians were hoping that the people in Russia would increase the pressure on Putin as well to end these sanctions. This is not something that came to be at all, has it? I do believe the pressure is palpable in Russia. Something we like to overlook is that when you have a military conflict that has started, if you had people dead on both sides, if you've lost fathers, brothers, sons, then you have the rage and anger and sadness growing on both sides of the conflict. So people don't look towards Putin first. First, it really brings you together to fight this war. If the war goes on for a long time, this effect will diminish, but we haven't gotten to this point yet. You see that they have done a lot in the past 10 to 15 years to make sure this kind of effect would be minimized. You can see how they recruit people. They recruit people from very distant parts of Russia. If they have any opposition, they have developed all kinds of ways to get them out of the way and to influence the public. You have also talked about something like this in your opening speech. In the 11th sanction package, we've had 8 Chinese companies that are also going to be sanctioned because they were helping Russia in circumventing the sanctions, to put it lightly. Then 5 were taken off the list again, so it's only 3 companies that are sanctioned. Did you want to have more political courage? Yes, definitely. If the Commission had suggested it, we would have definitely wanted for more courage. But you need to be able to vote on these things unanimously. And the suggestions of the Commission were not able to be adapted as suggested. But even if companies are not sanctioned, we can still try to prove that they have participated in circumventing the sanctions. This is more difficult, of course, but there are still many, many companies in China. So you will have dummy companies that will keep doing what the companies that have been restricted are doing now. It's like a hydra. You cut off a head and 2 grow back. We need to make sure that we follow up on everything we sell. And well, who is the one taking care of this for the sanctions right now? It's quite a sad story, but if all 8 companies had been on the list, we would still have had our hands full with this subject. Olaf, you no longer have executive powers, so you're not able to punish companies. This is something that happens on a national level. Could you tell me what the cooperation between big countries like Germany is like? This is something I've mentioned in the beginning as well. The key here is the exchange of information and the shared analysis of the situation. Of course, we can prove that a German company has tried circumventing the sanctions. Then we inform the German state and they will take appropriate measures. Our cooperation is going very well in this regard. Of course, we are not a public prosecutor, but we can investigate. We can pass on information. And sharing information and a shared analysis really is the key, because it's so terribly complex and they work through so many ports and so many third parties and third countries that you have to collect information and pass it on to the responsible countries. So how do the countries react to this? I can imagine that Eastern European companies of states are more proactive there because they have a more direct influence from Russia than, say, a country like Germany. Well, they are essential. Their participation is essential and they're highly interested. We have done a little asking around, and Lithuania has named over 50 cases that might be or actually were relevant for bigger states. I'm not going to name any names, maybe I would just say 4 companies. So you can definitely see a difference in how this is perceived. But nonetheless, during this workshop, all members, also Germany, have cooperated very well and have undertaken the promise to support and inform each other. Of course, the interest in this, as Ms. Deitelhoff said during her opening speech, is very different. And that's not even to mention Hungary. If we talk about more southern states, well, they don't really feel the pressure as much. This is perfectly normal. Based on the politics on national level, you'll see big differences also. But in the end, we have to find this fight together. I have the feeling that this workshop was very good, great success, and the colleagues involved are also passing on information. Can I ask an additional question about this, actually? If you look at cases and if you look at proof, if you say company A has exported to Russia, now this is sanctioned, now they're supplying the same thing to Kazakhstan in the same amount. So this is something you have to look into, right? Is this something you are following up on? Because it should be something that's done on a national level, where national Agardok will say, now I'd like you to explain to me why you're sending all of this to Kazakhstan, and if you can't have any proof for this, then you don't get to send this. Well, you can look into the exports to Kazakhstan, for example. You can ask where they're going, where they come from, and if you followed up on your legal due diligence. And I think it would have a very big impact just asking this, and they'll be much more careful. However, we can't just look at flows of traffic and flows of trade, because these flows of traffic are not enforceable proof. We need to have proof at a company level, at a personal level. Thank you very much. Mr. Gahler, back to you. We have European elections in 1 year. There is pressure from European countries to end the sanctions against Russia, particularly the AfD in Germany, right-wing party, does this. So what kind of importance will this have for the European elections for next year? Well, I think that the AfD will be able to get something out of it, but they will mostly focus out on immigration. We have a seemingly general consensus all over Europe, from the mainstream to extreme left to extreme right, that Moscow and the sanctions against Russia are something that we should uphold. All mainstream parties are very clear on this. We have no reason to end the sanctions for as long as the war wages on. They've also talked about the cost of the sanctions. So do the European civilians pay, and do they pay more than Russians? This is also a question that was raised in the German government, the FDP, the Liberal Party in Germany, specifically concerning the energy prices. Well, I can only talk for my institutions, of course. We have always been ahead of the curve. We have requested things that were later also approved. Maybe this has to do with our parliament. We never had any illusions about the intentions, the ideas of this regime. Same for Nord Stream 2. We've had a clear mind about this as well. We can see that this has caused a lot of damage to us politically. And if you look at this systematic approach where you don't have free speech, where you have a dictatorship, that you have a system that reminds us of the Second World War, well, you can't have any concessions, you can't have any appeasement in a system like that. We need to stand together as one community. And the financial aspects are also something we're going to have to push through. This started in 2014 with the occupation of the Crimean area and then shooting down airplanes. This is not something we've taken too seriously. And then we had Nord Stream 2 in 2015. this is something that, looking back, we need to do better for the future.
Since we don't have a lot of time left, I would like to take a look into the audience to see whether any one of you would have any questions with regards to what you've just heard. I cannot see any hands raised. Yes, we have a gentleman here in the first row. Perhaps he could have a microphone.
Kurt Geisert, ich gehöre zu dem Team.
Yes, I am actually from the House of European History. We heard yesterday that the chief of the CIA traveled to Kiev a few months ago and held talks with regards to the offensive, where a lot of hopes had been raised. And it was about optimism from the Ukrainian side. They were hoping that by the end of the year they would be as far as moving Russia to the negotiating table. Yes, Ms. Deitelhoff, perhaps you would like to answer. Yes, we have already talked about that. This is not necessarily something that has directly to do with sanctions. I think what has been discussed there was some sort of a deal, the fact that we are going to support you as long as necessary so that we will have a solution perhaps by the end of the year. I think that we may have talks by the end of the year, but I don't think that they will be sustainable. I don't think that we are going to see any sustainable results. Yes, please. Wolfgang Pape, I used to work for the Commission. I have a question for Professor Deitelhoff. You mentioned that the majority of the world population in the UN General Assembly did not favor the sanctions. What possibilities do you see for the EU to actually have an impact on this, the signaling effect of the sanctions? I think we can actually see that with the non-alignment movement. What kind of possibilities of influence does the EU have? Well, perhaps I'm just going to rephrase that. A very large majority of member states of the UN have actually condemned the Russian war of aggression twice. The minority of those countries that did not do that actually involves or includes more than half of the majority of the world population. We are currently in a situation where in the international state community, we actually have a rather large group in the global south that actually do not tend to one or the other side. They actually want to stay out of it. But I think this is due to two facts. First of all, the communicative effect of the sanctions. They look at China, for example, with regards to Taiwan, for example, actually think about what you're about to do very well. And the second aspect is equally as important. In this situation, I think it is about rebuilding the trust that has been lost over the years by providing attractive offers to the countries of the global south by looking at what are their interests with regards to renewable energies, but also with regards to other areas, technical cooperation. I think we actually touch a number of rather sensitive areas where we have to be very careful. How can we balance these two sides to actually gain new friends? Mr. Gahler, perhaps also from your side an answer. I think there are also a number of countries that actually just look from the sidelines to see who is going to win. a lot of countries in Latin America, in Africa, but also Asia, those who are afraid of China, they actually wait and see whether the European Union is actually going to come out, or how the European Union is going to come out of this conflict, or whether in our continent we can actually maintain our position. If they would see that the EU in their own continent would actually withdraw or retreat from that situation, they would perhaps think about whether they would have more trade contact with the European Union. And I think, therefore, for us, it is very important to not become losers in this conflict. Yes, we have two more questions from those listening online. One of them, I think, is for Mr. Schwarz. In what areas is OLAF active with regards to enforcing sanctions for Russian oligarchs? Are there any rules that would need to be changed in order to facilitate the work of OLAF with that regard? Well, I think certain individuals have been put on the sanction lists, and this also includes Russian oligarchs, most of them actually. OLAF, I think, only has limited impact on that work. This is not our main area of work. With regards to the area of sanctions, we are active where it is about worldwide trade, customs, and we actually work with the customs authorities. This is something where we are rather strong. We have a global network that we can rely on. We can receive a lot of information. We have extensive databases. This is our strength. Legally, the topic that the fact that we participate in enforcing these sanctions, member states do support us. All member states actually participated in the workshop that I mentioned before, but I know that the federal government, for example, says that the legal foundation, the Article 515, perhaps this is rather weak, but it is in our national interest, and therefore we are going to cooperate in this individual case. We could perhaps strengthen the legal foundation in future, and this is something that we think about together with the new Commission, both on the topic of the sanctions, but also with regards to other topics. We do notice in a lot of areas that we have enforcement gaps. For example, the export of illegal waste from the EU into other countries. This also has to do with customs and international trade of goods. In this regard, we have a big enforcement problem, but also the export of fraud items. I think in order to enforce these mechanisms in a better way, I think we could perhaps strengthen the legal foundation. Yes, another question with regards to oligarchs, and this question is for Ms. Deitelhoff. We hear again and again that the sanctions are also problematic in the sense that they are actually linking oligarchs closer to Putin. This is very difficult to answer. On the one hand, for example, if we withdrew visa and if we did no longer give them the opportunity to leave Russia, obviously this would have a certain effect, but at the same time, we have seen that Putin has been able to acquire quite a lot of means of pressure in order to put pressure on these oligarchs. The different sanction regimes in the US and in the EU, and if we look at the richest oligarchs, I don't know how many of them are actually on the sanctions lists, only 3. And that is the question. How can it be that we have these possibilities, but we are not capable of coming to an agreement to put all of those 30 individuals on the list. Yes, I have another very easy question for you. What do you think? What should change at EU level in order to enforce sanctions to a better extent? That would be my question. Well, obviously, this also has to do with competences. At the moment, we are working a lot with regards to cooperation, information exchange. We cannot investigate properly. We cannot listen into phone conversations, for example. We only have limited means of investigation. We do have quite a lot of means with regards to our budget, but with regards to other means to investigate these sanction evasions are rather limited. And this is what we would need in order to be more effective. Yes, perhaps you would also need more operative competences and the partners as well. Yes, we are almost at the end of our meeting. You just mentioned the key word US. We are going to the presidential elections in the US are not far away. Perhaps just a quick comment from your side. What could those elections, what kind of impact could those elections have on the sanctions? Also with regards to trade between the US and the G7 partners. I am very sure that Mr. Trump is not going to be elected as the new president. He might be a candidate, but I don't think that Americans are going to make the same mistake once again. No. I am quite sure. I'm determined. This is not going to happen. He's not going to be the president once again. If it is going to be a Republican, the conversations that we had 1 month ago in Washington showed that there is a rather bipartisan consensus with regards to this topic of sanctions. And obviously, we also hope that the war is not going to continue into the next legislative period in the US. Well, I'm not that optimistic with regards to Mr. Trump, but I think that we are going to see changes if the Republicans are going to win. And with a Republican administration, I think we would have a lot more tension. And I think that the EU is going to be in a lot more demand. They would need to compensate a lot, and I think a deal that would need to be made might not be in the best interest of the EU. I am in agreement with what Professor Deitelhoff just said. We traveled to the US in March and had a number of discussions and meetings. And what we were told is that the current administration is working with us rather well. But if there were a regime change, that might be different. Also with regards to financially supporting Ukraine, for example, this is where OLAF has been active with regards to prevention of corruption and fraud, for example. And this is also when they said that, well, if the Republicans would be the next administration, financial support would be rather limited. And I think that we should be worried. Yes, we'll wait and see. And a big thank you to all of those panel discussion participants. And I would like to let you know what our next event will be, the 21st European Press Club, with the topic, is the EU already in the election mode? This is going to be held in a week's time, Thursday, 13th of July from 7 p.m. Thank you very much for your interest, and I hope to see you very soon. And I would also like to let you know, for all of those present here, you are welcome to join us for coffee and cake. Goodbye and see you soon.